Okay, let's unpack this. Pride. It's one of those feelings we all recognize, right? That lift you get when you really nail something or, see someone you care about shine. Feels good.
Yeah, definitely.
But the word itself, it has this complicated history, that whole deadly sin thing. And then it's also used for people who are just, well, difficult.
Right.
So it makes you wonder, what's the real difference between feeling good about yourself and being, frankly, a bit of a pain?
That's the crux of it, isn't it? It's a question that really gets to the heart of how we see ourselves and others. And as the material we've been looking at points out, what might seem like similar feelings on the surface are actually rooted in very different psychological territory.
Okay.
We're going to delve into the vital distinction between what's been termed authentic pride and hubristic pride, and how that second one, hubristic pride, connects with narcissism.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, our mission is really to get beyond the surface level. We want to understand these two faces of pride and this broader concept of narcissism.
Right.
We want to give you a clearer picture of what they are, where they come from, and how they play out in our lives and the relationships around us.
Yeah.
Think of this as your shortcut to navigating this really important aspect of, well, human psychology.
And what's fascinating right from the start is that authentic pride, that healthy sense of satisfaction, isn't just feeling good. It involves a real element of self-awareness.
Okay, how so?
It tends to arise when we reflect on our actions, our accomplishments, and we feel a genuine positivity about what we've done. It's centered on that, what one did.
Right, so it's tied to a specific thing, an effort. And the source mentions this idea of an attributional basis. Can you break that down a bit? How do we explain our successes to ourselves when we feel this kind of pride?
Certainly. So when we experience authentic pride, we typically attribute our achievements to factors that are internal, yes, but also things we could influence.
Yeah.
Our effort, the strategies we use, the hard work. It's the feeling of, I succeeded because I put the work in. Now, compare that with hubristic pride. The explanations there also tend to focus on internal factors, but one's seen as stable and beyond our control, like innate talent, or just being inherently better. It's the difference between thinking my studying paid off versus I'm just smart.
Okay, that's a really clear distinction. So recognizing your own agency versus just feeling inherently gifted. Yeah. And what kind of emotional landscape comes with this authentic pride? What does it feel like?
Well, the feelings are generally very positive, and they really contribute to our overall well-being. We tend to feel accomplished, confident in our abilities, productive, fulfilled, even, a sense of triumph that feels genuinely earned. It's a deep satisfaction.
So it's more than just a fleeting pat on the back. It's connected to something more substantial, right? The source links it to genuine self-esteem. How does that work?
Well, there's a really strong and positive feedback loop there. When we achieve something through our own effort, it gives us concrete evidence of our competence, our capabilities.
Right.
And this, in turn, strengthens our underlying sense of self-worth in a healthy, stable way. This is actually a key difference from narcissism, where the self-esteem is often quite shaky underneath.
Okay. So the confidence is built on a foundation of actual accomplishments, not just wishful thinking.
Exactly.
What else contributes to this feeling of authentic pride? Where does it come from internally?
Often it arises from meeting standards we've set for ourselves or acting in line with our personal values. It's not solely dependent on, say, external applause.
Right.
The emphasis is on the act itself, the doing of something well, rather than just a general feeling of being a certain kind of person. And it's fundamentally linked to that sense of achievement, the satisfaction of reaching a goal through your own efforts.
Okay, so we're talking about a pride that's earned, driven by our own internal compass and our dedication. How does this show up in our behavior? What characteristics do we usually see?
Interestingly, authentic pride is often associated with a prosocial outlook. People feeling this way tend to be more altruistic, more willing to cooperate and help others, and they show more empathy. It's almost as if feeling good about your own contributions makes you more inclined to connect with and support the people around you, strengthening those social ties.
That's almost the opposite of how we sometimes think about pride, as being a bit isolating or self-absorbed.
Exactly. And the research supports this. Individuals experiencing authentic pride tend to score higher on positive personality traits like agreeableness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and emotional stability, which is a stark contrast to hubristic pride, which often shows negative correlations with agreeableness and conscientiousness.
So instead of being boastful and maybe putting others down, someone with authentic pride is more likely to be considerate, responsible. That's a big
A
difference.
very significant difference.
What about what drives us? How does authentic pride influence our motivation?
It acts as a really powerful internal motivator. It fuels that intrinsic drive, making us want to keep working towards goals even without immediate external rewards.
Right.
The positive feeling reinforces the very behaviors that led to it. And what's also fascinating is that even a temporary dip in authentic pride after a setback can be adaptive.
How so?
It can prompt us to reevaluate, adjust our approach. This is actually a key element of resilience. And it seems to be connected with greater self-control, too.
So it's not just a pleasant feeling. It actually helps us grow, bounce back from challenges. What are some of the bigger long-term benefits of nurturing this authentic pride?
Oh, the benefits are substantial. It contributes to greater overall well-being, increased life satisfaction, happiness, a sense of hopefulness. It even shows a negative correlation with things like depression and anxiety. Some models of psychological flourishing, like the PERMA model, actually include accomplishment, which is so closely tied to authentic pride as a fundamental component.
That makes perfect sense. Feeling like you've achieved something meaningful would definitely boost your overall well-being. What about how we interact with the world, with other people?
It improves our social functioning in various ways. It helps us build and maintain healthy relationships, gain acceptance and respect within our social circles. It's linked to achieving what's called prestige-based social status. That's respect earned through competence, skill, and those prosocial behaviors we talked about. Even our nonverbal cues when we feel authentic pride can communicate competence.
So it's about earning respect through your actions and abilities, not demanding it because you think you deserve it.
Precisely.
And finally, how does authentic pride help our own personal development over time?
It encourages a growth-oriented mindset. When we experience authentic pride, we're more likely to have a realistic view of both successes and failures. We tend to see failures as learning opportunities,
Right.
which fosters optimism and can even spark creative new ideas.
Okay, so authentic pride sounds like a really positive, constructive force. Rooted in effort, builds real self-esteem, encourages positive social stuff, helps us learn and grow.
That sums it up well.
Now let's shift gears a bit and explore the other side. Harmful narcissism. The source says it exists on a spectrum. What does that mean exactly?
Exactly. Narcissism isn't just black and white, on or off. Many people might show some narcissistic traits sometimes without it causing major problems.
Okay.
But at the more extreme end, these traits can become narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. For an NPD diagnosis, these patterns have to be, deeply ingrained, show up across different situations, be maladaptive, meaning they cause problems, and lead to significant distress or impairment in functioning. And these patterns typically show up by early adulthood. It's important to remember these are clinical criteria.
Right, used by professionals. And the source outlines some specific criteria from the DSM-5-TR. Could you walk us through a few key ones? What kind of behaviors or thoughts define it?
Sure. There are 9 criteria listed, and someone needs to meet at least 5 for an NPD diagnosis. Some key ones include a grandiose sense of self-importance, being preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or ideal love, believing they're special and unique and should only associate with other high-status people, requiring excessive admiration, having a strong sense of entitlement, being interpersonally exploitative, so using others, lacking empathy, often being envious of others or believing others envy them, and showing arrogant, haughty behaviors or attitudes.
Wow, that paints a pretty clear picture.
Yeah.
It's definitely more than just being confident.
Much more.
And this is where hubristic pride comes in, right?
Yeah.
How does that fit?
Precisely. Hubristic pride is often seen as the emotional fuel driving these narcissistic self-views. It's characterized by feelings of arrogance, conceit, smugness, being boastful. It's that subjective feeling of being inherently superior.
So, if authentic pride is about the satisfaction of doing something well, hubristic pride seems more about the feeling of being inherently superior.
Exactly.
And like authentic pride has its attributional basis, what's the typical explanation for success with hubristic pride?
With hubristic pride, successes are usually chalked up to those internal factors again, but specifically things seen as stable and unchangeable innate talent, inherent superiority, fixed abilities. It's the feeling of, I'm successful because I'm just naturally gifted, not because of sustained effort or learning from mistakes.
Okay, so the focus is on this fixed sense of superiority. Doesn't need effort. Now, The source gets into some core features of narcissism, starting with this interesting idea of grandiosity versus vulnerability. It's not always the same outward show, is it?
That's a really crucial point. Often, we picture the overtly grandiose person, loud, attention-seeking, openly boastful, and that's definitely one manifestation.
Right, the stereotype.
But there's also what's called vulnerable or covert narcissism. These individuals might seem more hypersensitive to criticism, insecure, even withdrawn, maybe more introverted, but still harboring those underlying feelings of entitlement and a tendency towards manipulation.
So it's not always the obvious larger-than-life persona. Sometimes it's much more subtle.
Much more subtle.
But the source also says these two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive in one person.
Exactly. Individuals can actually shift between these grandiose and vulnerable states. Sometimes that outward grandiosity acts as a defense mechanism, shielding them from underlying feelings of inadequacy or shame. That confident exterior can be surprisingly fragile.
That makes sense. So like an overcompensation, maybe, hiding insecurities.
Precisely.
Another key feature seems to be this intense need for admiration, often called narcissistic supply. What's that about?
This is really defining. There's a persistent, excessive need for external validation, praise, attention, admiration from others. This constant seeking of approval comes from that lack of a stable internal sense of self-worth we talked about. They rely on this narcissistic supply to prop up their often fragile ego.
It sounds exhausting, constantly needing that external fuel.
It can be, both for them and those around them.
Another really damaging aspect seems to be the lack of empathy. How does that show up?
Yes, this is a core deficit. It involves an unwillingness or inability to truly recognize, understand, and respond to the feelings and needs of others. Now, some individuals with narcissistic traits might intellectually get what someone else is feeling, that's cognitive empathy, but they often lack the ability to actually feel or share those emotions, which is affective empathy.
Right.
And this lack of genuine emotional connection often enables exploitative behavior.
Because if you don't really connect with or care about how your actions affect someone else, it's easier to take advantage.
Exactly.
Which leads to this sense of entitlement and exploitation that's often seen.
Precisely. Individuals with narcissistic traits often hold unreasonable expectations of special treatment. They genuinely believe rules and social norms don't apply to them like they do to others. And this entitlement frequently leads to interpersonally exploitive behavior, using other people as objects to achieve their own goals, fulfill their needs, or boost their status, with very little regard for the impact on those people.
It all paints a picture of a very self-centered and ultimately harmful way of interacting.
Yeah.
And the source also looks at the psychological roots, starting with that fragile self-esteem we touched on.
Yes. Despite all the outward shows of superiority, at the core of narcissism and hubristic pride, there's often a very unstable, fragile, sometimes deeply negative underlying sense of self-worth.
Right.
Those outward displays are often a defense mechanism, protecting that vulnerable inner self from feelings of inadequacy.
So the boasting and arrogance might actually signal underlying insecurity. That's really interesting. What else is going on underneath? The source mentions shame-proneness.
That's right. Hubristic pride and narcissism are often linked to a heightened susceptibility to feeling shame. That intense need to avoid feeling shame or humiliation is a big driver behind many narcissistic behaviors, like those angry reactions to criticism or denying responsibility.
Because criticism could expose those underlying inadequacies and trigger intense shame.
Exactly.
And finally, there's this external validation dependence. How does that fit into the psychological picture?
Yes. Unlike authentic pride, which draws strength from internal satisfaction and realistic accomplishment, narcissistic self-worth is almost entirely reliant on external sources, admiration, status, praise, perceived envy. This makes their self-esteem incredibly volatile, constantly needing reinforcement from the outside.
So it's this whole interconnected system, grandiosity often masking vulnerability, a desperate need for external approval, lack of empathy enabling exploitation, all potentially driven by shame and fragile self-esteem.
Yes, it's a complex, though dysfunctional way of trying to regulate self-esteem and protect a deeply insecure sense of self. It's definitely more complex than just someone being overly confident.
Okay, so we've really unpacked both authentic pride and harmful narcissism. Now let's try and crystallize the key differences. The source had a really helpful table comparing them. Let's walk through some key factors. First, the fundamental source of feeling. Where does the feeling itself come from in each case?
Right. For authentic pride, the feeling arises from specific achievements, the effort put in, the doing of something valued. For narcissism and hubristic pride, the feeling tends to stem from a more generalized sense of self, a belief in inherent superiority or talent, the being. It's a global sense of just being better.
And that directly impacts the source of self-worth for each, doesn't it?
Precisely. Authentic pride helps build internal validation, a genuine and stable self-esteem earned through accomplishments. Narcissism, however, relies heavily on external admiration that narcissistic supply, and the self-esteem is often fragile or artificially inflated.
Then there's the really critical difference in empathy.
Absolutely critical. Authentic pride is generally associated with having empathy, a prosocial, considerate approach. Narcissism is characterized by low or even a complete lack of empathy, which often leads to exploitation and disregard for others' feelings.
And how do people experiencing each type tend to respond to criticism or failure?
Someone with authentic pride is more likely to see criticism as a potential learning opportunity, a chance for reflection and growth. They can acknowledge failures without it shattering their self-worth.
Okay.
A narcissistic individual, however, will often react to criticism with intense anger, denial, defensiveness, blame, shame, or even just shutting down completely.
That defensiveness seems like a big tell. What about their underlying motivation? What's driving their actions?
Authentic pride fuels intrinsic goals, wanting mastery, personal growth, the satisfaction of effort itself.
Right.
Narcissism tends to be driven by extrinsic goals, the constant need for admiration, chasing status and power over others.
So it's the difference between wanting to be competent versus wanting to be dominant.
Well put.
And that difference in motivation also shapes their social strategy, right?
Yeah.
How do they typically try to relate to others?
Exactly. Authentic pride often leads to a social strategy focused on achieving prestige, earning respect through competence, skill, positive contributions. Hubristic pride and narcissism, however, often involve a strategy of dominance, trying to get status and control through coercion, intimidation, manipulation.
That difference in how they seek status, earning it versus seizing it, is incredibly revealing.
It really is.
And the table also highlighted some key personality correlates.
Yes. Authentic pride aligns with traits like genuine self-esteem, agreeableness, conscientiousness, prosocial tendencies.
Yep.
Narcissism, perhaps unsurprisingly, correlates with arrogance, entitlement, aggression, and lower levels of both agreeableness and conscientiousness.
Not exactly a recipe for healthy relationships.
Far from it.
Which brings us to the relationship impact. What kind of relationships do these different forms of pride tend to foster?
Authentic pride generally fosters connection, trust, mutual respect, healthy interdependence.
Nice.
Narcissism, however, often leads to conflict, exploitation, emotional abuse, and a fundamental lack of trust.
It's a really stark contrast. And finally, the associated keywords really summarize the essence.
Absolutely. For authentic pride, accomplished, confident, fulfilled. For narcissism and hubristic pride, arrogant, conceited, entitled, smug, superior.
That comparison really lays it out clearly. Now let's delve into the real-world implications. What are the broader consequences of cultivating authentic pride versus falling into narcissistic patterns?
The impact is significant, really far-reaching. As we've said, authentic pride generally fosters healthier, more fulfilling relationships built on respect and trust.
Right.
It contributes to greater overall well-being, better resilience, life satisfaction, better mental health outcomes. It also fuels motivation and can contribute to positive leadership styles.
So it creates a really positive upward spiral.
You could say that, yes.
What about the impact of narcissism? It sounds like a much more destructive path, not just for the individual, but for everyone around them.
It absolutely is. Relationships with individuals showing narcissistic traits are often described as toxic, marked by frequent conflict, emotional exploitation, significant distress for those involved. Our source touches on some really damaging manipulative tactics, things like gaslighting, where someone's reality is systematically undermined.
Awful.
Manipulation, devaluation, isolating people from their support systems, and a complete lack of accountability for their actions.
Those are incredibly harmful behaviors. They can really erode someone's sense of self. The source even mentions narcissistic abuse and narcissistic victim syndrome. What does terms mean?
Well, narcissistic abuse isn't a formal clinical diagnosis, but it describes a recognizable pattern of emotional, psychological, sometimes even financial or physical abuse by individuals with significant narcissistic traits. Narcissistic victim syndrome refers to a collection of symptoms people subjected to this kind of abuse often experience. Things like anxiety, depression, PTSD-like symptoms, a diminished sense of self-worth, major difficulty trusting others. The impact on partners, family, friends can be truly devastating.
It sounds incredibly painful for those on the receiving end. But what about the individuals with narcissistic traits? Are they somehow immune? Do they just live happily in their grandiosity bubble?
Not at all. Despite any outward confidence, individuals with narcissistic traits often have persistent difficulties in relationships, struggle with work or school, can face financial instability, and are at higher risk for other mental health issues, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, even suicidal thoughts.
Hmm.
Their seemingly confident exterior often masks a great deal of inner turmoil and unhappiness.
It sounds like a lonely and ultimately unfulfilling way to live. The source also mentioned career trajectories, suggesting that while some traits might lead to initial success, it's often unsustainable. Why is that?
That's a really insightful observation. Initially, traits like charisma, a strong drive, albeit often for external validation and maybe risk-taking, might help someone climb the ladder.
Right, they might seem like go-getters.
Exactly. Maybe even seem decisive or visionary. But those core traits, the lack of empathy, exploiting others, poor teamwork, difficulty with criticism, tend to create toxic work environments, erode morale, and ultimately lead to career derailment, either for themselves or those working under them. It's a stark contrast to the more sustainable, collaborative success fostered by authentic pride and genuine competence.
So in the long run, that lack of genuine connection and ethical behavior tends to catch up.
It often does.
Now, perhaps the most important question: how do we actively cultivate that healthy, authentic pride in ourselves, and how can we navigate interactions with those who show harmful narcissistic traits?
Okay, fostering authentic pride really centers on focusing on our own internal processes and growth. It involves consciously noticing and valuing the effort we put in, setting realistic, achievable goals, practicing self-compassion when we stumble, maybe even keeping a little record of accomplishments, big and small, and grounding ourselves in our own intrinsic values, not just chasing external validation.
So it's a deliberate shift in focus inward towards our efforts, our values, rather than always looking outside for approval.
Exactly.
What about recognizing those narcissistic traits, both maybe in ourselves and in others? What are key things to look out for?
It starts with increasing our awareness. Being mindful of those key indicators we discussed: grandiosity, entitlement, lack of empathy, needing admiration, extreme sensitivity to criticism.
Right.
Self-reflection is crucial. Where does my pride really come from? How do I react to feedback? Am I genuinely concerned about others' well-being, or are my interactions mostly about my needs?
Good questions.
And when observing others, look for consistent patterns of exploitation, manipulation, lack of accountability, disregard for others' feelings.
It requires real honesty with ourselves and careful observation of relationship dynamics.
It does.
And if we do find ourselves dealing with someone exhibiting these traits, what practical strategies can help protect ourselves?
Okay, number one, setting and consistently enforcing clear boundaries. This is absolutely paramount for self-preservation. Define what's acceptable, what's not, and stick to it.
Okay.
Crucial. Also, manage your expectations. Deeply ingrained narcissistic patterns are unlikely to change significantly without professional help. Don't expect miracles.
Right.
Try to avoid taking their behavior personally. It often stems from their internal state, not your worth. If you need to give feedback, focus on specific observable behaviors, not general attacks.
Makes sense.
And critically, maintain your external support systems. Stay connected with supportive, grounded people. Don't let yourself get isolated.
Yes.
And in situations where the behavior is consistently harmful, consider limiting contact or even ending the relationship entirely. Sometimes that's necessary for your own well-being.
Those are incredibly valuable strategies for navigating what can be really tough interactions. So as we bring this deep dive to a close, what's the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the central message is that authentic pride, rooted in genuine effort and achievement, is a cornerstone of healthy self-esteem and fulfilling relationships.
Yeah.
Narcissism, on the other hand, fueled by needing external validation and lacking empathy, is ultimately destructive for the individual and those around them.
It really underscores the importance of being mindful of where our own feelings of pride and self-worth come from.
Exactly. And that self-awareness is the critical first step in being able to tell the difference between these patterns, both in ourselves and in others.
So for you listening, here's a final thought to mull over.
Yeah.
Take some time to reflect on the source of your own feelings of pride. Are you building genuine self-worth through your efforts, your contributions, your connections? Or are you maybe more focused on seeking that fleeting external validation? As we've explored today, that fundamental difference has profound, long-lasting implications for your well-being, your relationships, your growth. Perhaps it's worth exploring further how you can cultivate more self-compassion and set those healthy boundaries in your own life.